7-year-old girl in a pink dress approached the marble tomb. While tourists watched in respectful silence, she made a gesture that stopped Sentinel Corporal Marcus Hayes cold. 3 taps on her chest, followed by a military salute. His composed face cracked for just a moment. Before we reveal the heartbreaking story behind that secret signal and why it moved a tomb guard to break 90 years of unbroken protocol, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. If stories of honor, sacrifice, and keeping promises move your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're sharing another powerful story that will remind you why some bonds can never be broken. The morning mist hung over Arlington National Cemetery like a sacred veil, touching the white marble headstones with gentle reverence. At the heart of this hallowed ground stood the tomb of the unknown soldier, where America honors its fallen heroes, whose names were lost to war, but whose sacrifice would never be forgotten. The tomb itself was a masterpiece of solemn beauty, carved from pristine white marble and inscribed with words that spoke to the soul of a grateful nation. Here, beneath this monument, lay the remains of unidentified service members from World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and for a time Vietnam, representing all those who gave their lives in service to their country. Corporal Marcus Hayes had been walking his watch with mechanical precision, his red-striped uniform pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut glass. The white gloves on his hands were spotless, his black shoes polished to mirror brightness, and his rifle gleamed in the early morning sun. For 21 measured steps, he moved across the black rubber mat, each footfall landing exactly where thousands of sentinels before him had placed their own. Turn. Pause for exactly 21 seconds. Face the tomb. Turn again. 21 more steps in the opposite direction. This was the dance of honor that had continued unbroken since 1937. Through world wars and peace, through presidents and protests, through seasons of national triumph and seasons of national grief, the sentinel's duty was absolute, unwavering, sacred. No weather could stop it. No distraction could break it. No personal concern could interfere with it. Marcus had trained for months to earn this position, studying every movement, every angle, every breath, until the routine became as natural as his heartbeat. He had memorized the history of every unknown soldier, learned the significance of every ceremonial detail, and committed himself to maintaining the unbroken chain of honor that stretched back nearly a century. But beneath the ceremonial precision, Marcus carried a weight that no training manual could prepare him for. 6 months earlier, he had lost his closest friend and brother-in-arms, Staff Sergeant Sofia Rodriguez, in a roadside bombing outside Kandahar. David had been more than a fellow soldier. He had been the anchor that kept Marcus steady through 2 brutal tours of Afghanistan. They had shared foxholes and fears, dreams of home and nightmares of war. In the chaos of combat, David's steady voice had been the compass that guided Marcus through the darkness when everything else seemed hopeless. Their friendship had been forged in the crucible of war, tempered by shared danger and mutual dependence. David was the type of soldier who never left anyone behind, who always found a way to bring humor to the darkest moments, who carried pictures of his daughter in his helmet and talked about her constantly during the long, quiet hours of guard duty. He had saved Marcus's life on more than one occasion, pulling him from harm's way when improvised explosive devices detonated too close, providing covering fire when Taliban fighters closed in, always watching his back with the fierce loyalty that only soldiers understand. The night before David's final deployment, they had sat outside their barracks at Fort Bragg, under a canopy of stars that seemed impossibly bright against the darkness. The conversation had started with the usual soldier talk about plans after service, about families back home, about the future that waited beyond the war. But as the night deepened, David's tone had grown serious in a way that made Marcus pay closer attention. There was something in his friend's voice, a premonition perhaps, that suggested this conversation was more important than their usual late-night talks. David had pulled out his phone and shown Marcus a picture of a little girl with dark curls and sparkling eyes, maybe 6 years old, grinning at the camera with the uninhibited joy that only children possess. Her name was Sofia, and she was everything to David, the reason he fought to come home from every mission, the light that kept him going through the darkest moments of war. Her mother and David were no longer together, and the separation had been hard on Sofia, who struggled to understand why her daddy had to keep going away to dangerous places where bad things happened. To help her cope with his absences, David had created a special signal between them, a secret code that was theirs alone. 3 taps on the chest represented the 3 words that mattered most between a father and daughter, and a small salute meant staying soldiers strong until they could be together again. The gesture seemed simple enough, almost like a game, but David's expression had been deadly serious as he demonstrated it. He had made Marcus promise that if anything ever happened to him, if he didn't make it back from the war, Marcus would look after Sofia if she ever needed help. The promise had been given easily, the way promises between soldiers often are, born from brotherhood and sealed with trust. Marcus had assumed it was just David being overly cautious, the way soldiers sometimes get when they've seen too much combat and start thinking about mortality. Neither of them could have imagined that promise would be tested at the most sacred site in American military tradition, or that a little girl's gesture would force Marcus to choose between following orders and honoring the memory of a fallen friend. The June morning had started like countless others at Arlington National Cemetery. Tour groups arrived in waves, their voices hushed by the gravity of the place. School children pressed close to their teachers, wide-eyed at the solemnity surrounding them. Veterans stood with hands over hearts, many fighting back tears as they remembered friends who never came home. Families paid quiet respects to loved ones buried in the rolling hills, leaving flowers and flags, and sometimes just sitting in peaceful remembrance. Marcus had been on duty for less than an hour when he noticed a small figure at the edge of his peripheral vision. A little girl in a pink summer dress stood at the rope barrier with an elderly woman who appeared to be her grandmother. The child had the same dark curls from the photograph David had shown him all those months ago, though she was older now, maybe 7, and there was a solemnity to her posture that seemed far beyond her years. Something about her stillness, her focused attention, set her apart from the other children who typically visited the tomb with chattering excitement and endless questions. As Marcus completed his turn and began his next sequence of 21 steps, the little girl moved closer to the rope barrier that separated visitors from the sacred ground where the sentinel walked his eternal watch. Her grandmother whispered something to her, probably reminding her to stay quiet and respectful in this most sacred of places, but the child's attention was completely focused on Marcus. There was something in her eyes, a recognition that made his chest tighten with sudden understanding, though he couldn't yet allow himself to believe what his instincts were telling him. The crowd around the tomb was larger than usual for a weekday morning. Tourists snapped photos of the changing of the guard ceremony that had taken place an hour earlier. Veterans pointed out details to their grandchildren, explaining the significance of the unknown soldier and why this place mattered so much to American military tradition. A school group from Virginia sat cross-legged on the grass, their teacher reading from a prepared script about the history of the tomb and the dedication of the sentinels who guarded it. When Marcus reached the center point of his route, directly in front of the marble tomb where the unknown soldiers rested in eternal peace, the little girl raised her small hand. The movement was deliberate, purposeful, nothing like the random waves that children typically made when trying to get the guard's attention. 3 quick taps to her chest, tap, 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 each gesture precise and meaningful, exactly as David had described it during that late-night conversation at Fort Bragg. Then, with the precise form that could only have been taught by a soldier, she brought her hand to her forehead in a perfect military salute. The gesture was flawless, her tiny hand positioned correctly, her posture straight and respectful. It was not the awkward approximation that children usually attempted when they tried to mimic military customs, but a salute that had been carefully taught and lovingly practiced until it became second nature. The sight of that signal froze Marcus's blood and sent his mind reeling back 6 months to a promise made under distant stars. His step faltered, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that his carefully maintained composure cracked for the first time in his career as a sentinel. The routine that had become as natural as breathing suddenly felt foreign and difficult as the weight of recognition crashed over him like a wave. This was Sofia Rodriguez, daughter of Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez, the little girl from the photograph, grown older, but unmistakably the same child who had been the center of her father's universe. She had somehow found her way here, to this sacred place, carrying the memory of her father and the hope that his friend would remember the promise made under those Afghanistan stars. She was keeping faith with a code her daddy had taught her, trusting that soldiers keep their word even when it costs them everything. David's words came flooding back with crystal clarity. The promise, the photograph, the signal that was supposed to be just between a father and daughter, a private game to help a little girl cope with her daddy's dangerous job. But here she was, using their secret code at the tomb of the unknown soldier, looking at Marcus with desperate hope in her eyes, trusting that he would remember and understand. The crowd hadn't noticed his momentary hesitation, but Marcus felt as though the entire world had suddenly shifted on its axis. His training screamed at him to complete his route, to maintain the dignity of the watch, to honor the protocols that had been maintained for nearly a century without deviation. The rules governing the tomb guard were absolute and unforgiving, drilled into every sentinel until they became instinctive. The sentinel never deviates from his prescribed path. The sentinel never acknowledges individual visitors. The sentinel never allows personal concerns to interfere with the sacred duty of guarding America's unknown heroes. But across the rope barrier stood David's daughter, still holding her perfect salute, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks as she maintained her soldier-straight posture despite her obvious grief. Her grandmother had gone pale with recognition, understanding that this wasn't a child's random gesture, but something much deeper and more meaningful. The elderly woman's weathered hands trembled as she placed them gently on Sofia's shoulders, offering silent support, while her granddaughter honored her father's memory in the only way she knew how. As Marcus turned for his next sequence, his eyes met Sofia's again. She was still maintaining her perfect salute, still looking at him with the unwavering trust that only a child can have. The sight of her small face, so serious and hopeful, so reminiscent of David's own expression during their most difficult moments in Afghanistan, made Marcus's chest tighten with emotion he wasn't supposed to feel while on duty. The tension in the air became palpable as more visitors began to notice the unusual interaction unfolding before the tomb of the unknown soldier. What had started as a quiet moment between a child and a sentinel was beginning to draw attention from the growing crowd. Phones came out, though most visitors had enough respect for the sacred nature of the place to refrain from actually recording. Whispers rippled through the assembled tourists and veterans, a sense that something significant was happening.
Something that fell outside the normal bounds of cemetery protocol and military tradition. A park ranger stationed nearby moved closer,
his trained eye recognizing that the situation required careful observation. In his 5 years of duty at Arlington, he had seen countless attempts by visitors to break the tomb guard's concentration, from tourists making faces to children jumping and waving. But this felt different. The little girl's posture, her obvious emotional state, and the sentinel's barely perceptible reaction suggested something far more profound than the usual tourist interaction. Marcus knew he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just his military career, but his entire understanding of what honor truly meant. Everything he had worked for hung in the balance, suspended between duty to protocol and duty to a fallen brother. The prestige of being selected as a tomb guard was extraordinary. Fewer than 600 soldiers had ever earned this honor since the tradition began. The months of intensive training, the physical and mental demands, the pride of serving at America's most sacred military site, the respect that came with wearing the uniform of the old guard. All of it could disappear in an instant if he made the wrong choice. The weight of military tradition pressed down on him like a physical force. The tomb of the unknown soldier represented something larger than any individual soldier, larger than personal promises or private grief. It stood as a symbol of all Americans who had died in service to their country, particularly those whose remains could never be identified or returned to their families. The Sentinel's watch was a sacred trust, a commitment that transcended personal desires and individual circumstances. Breaking that trust, even for the most compelling reasons, went against everything the tomb represented. But this wasn't just any child making random gestures to get attention. This was Sofia Rodriguez, daughter of Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez, who had died serving his country in Afghanistan. She had traveled here with her grandmother, probably from hundreds of miles away, carrying the burden of her father's death and the hope that his friend would remember the promise made in a distant war zone. She was keeping faith with a code her daddy had taught her, trusting that soldiers keep their word even when it costs them everything. The sight of her maintaining that perfect salute, tears streaming down her cheeks but her posture unwavering, embodied everything that David had tried to teach her about being soldier strong. Marcus could almost hear his friend's voice, could almost see David's proud smile as he watched his daughter honor his memory with the dignity he had instilled in her. The promise Marcus had made wasn't just about helping a child in need. It was about honoring the sacrifice of a man who had saved his life repeatedly, who had died protecting his squad, who had loved his daughter more than life itself. The internal battle raged for what felt like hours, but was actually only seconds. Every instinct trained into him as a soldier screamed that he must maintain his post, must honor his duty to the unknown soldiers, must preserve the sanctity of the watch that had continued unbroken for decades. The court-martial that would inevitably follow any breach of protocol would end not just his time as a tomb guard, but likely his entire military career. The disgrace would follow him forever, marking him as the sentinel who broke faith with America's most sacred military tradition. Yet as Marcus looked at Sofia's face, he saw not just a grieving child, but the living legacy of his best friend's sacrifice. David had died believing that his brothers in arms would take care of his daughter, that the bonds forged in combat would extend beyond death to protect what mattered most to him. To ignore Sofia's signal, to let protocol override the promise of brotherhood, would be to dishonor not just David's memory, but the very values that made military service meaningful. The weight of that trust, the memory of David's sacrifice, and the sight of a little girl honoring her father's memory in the only way she knew how, crystallized Marcus's understanding of what true honor really meant. Some things were bigger than rules, bigger than regulations, bigger than the fear of consequences. Some promises transcended even the most sacred protocols. Some moments demanded that honor be measured not by adherence to procedures, but by loyalty to the bonds that make military service a calling rather than just a job. Marcus's next turn brought him face to face with Sofia once more. This time he didn't look away. This time, he made a choice that would echo through military history and redefine what it meant to guard the tomb of America's unknown heroes. The decision crystallized in his mind with absolute clarity, driven not by impulse, but by a deep understanding of what David would have wanted, what Sofia needed, and what true military honor demanded in this unprecedented moment. With deliberate, measured steps that maintained the dignity of his position while breaking every rule that governed it, Marcus stepped out of his prescribed pattern. The movement was subtle at first, a slight deviation that might have been mistaken for a normal adjustment to his route. But as he continued walking, it became clear that he was abandoning his post and moving directly toward the rope barrier where Sofia waited with patient hope. The silence that fell over the crowd was profound and immediate, as if the very air around the tomb of the unknown soldier had suddenly become too sacred to disturb with sound. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Camera phones lowered. Children sensed the gravity of the moment and moved closer to their parents, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the birds seemed to pause in their singing as hundreds of people watched a tomb guard do something that had never happened before in the nearly 9 decades of the unbroken. Watch. Marcus stopped exactly 1 pace from the rope barrier, close enough to see the hope and recognition shining in Sofia's tear-filled eyes, close enough to honor the promise he had made to her father under distant stars. The little girl's salute never wavered, even as tears continued to stream down her cheeks. She stood soldier straight despite her grief, embodying the strength and discipline her father had tried to teach her, showing a courage that would have made David Rodriguez burst with pride. In full view of the gathered crowd, in violation of every protocol that governed his sacred duty, Corporal Marcus Hayes came to attention and rendered a full military salute to 7-year-old Sofia Rodriguez. The gesture was precise, respectful, and deeply meaningful. It was the salute of one soldier to another, the acknowledgement of shared loss and shared honor. It was a promise kept and a bond honored that transcended the boundaries between life and death, between duty and love, between following orders and doing what was right. Sofia's face transformed at that moment, grief giving way to something like peace. The weight she had been carrying, the burden of wondering if anyone remembered her daddy, if anyone cared about his sacrifice, seemed to lift from her small shoulders. She returned Marcus's salute with the precision her father had taught her during their bedtime games. Two soldiers separated by age and circumstance, but united by love and duty and the unbreakable bonds that connect those who serve. The crowd watched in respectful silence, many wiping away tears as they witnessed something that transcended military protocol and touched the very heart of what it means to serve one's country. Veterans in the crowd recognized the profound significance of what was happening, understanding that they were seeing honor in its purest form, stripped of regulations and procedures and reduced to its essential truth, that soldiers take care of each other, in life and in death, no matter the cost. By now, word was spreading through Arlington that something extraordinary was happening at the tomb. Park rangers spoke urgently into their radios, unsure how to handle a situation that fell completely outside their training and experience. Other tomb guards at their positions around the cemetery maintained their watches, but cast worried glances toward Marcus's location, torn between their duty to their own posts and their concern for a fellow sentinel who was clearly facing a career-ending crisis. The commanding officer of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Patterson, received the emergency call in her office and rushed to the scene, unable to believe the report that a sentinel had broken protocol at the tomb of the unknown soldier. In 30 years of military service, she had never heard those words, had never imagined a scenario where the unthinkable could happen at America's most sacred military site. When Patterson arrived, she expected to find a crisis requiring immediate damage control, a situation that would demand swift disciplinary action to preserve the integrity of the tomb guard tradition. Instead, she found a moment of profound human connection that had transformed a military ceremony into something deeper and more meaningful. The crowd's reverent silence, the dignity that somehow remained despite the breach of protocol, and the sight of a decorated soldier honoring a fallen comrade's daughter, all combined to create a scene that spoke to the very soul of military service. After quickly assessing the situation and speaking quietly with Sofia's grandmother, Patterson learned the story behind the signal and understood the impossible choice Marcus had faced. Maria Rodriguez, David's mother, explained through tears how Sofia had insisted on coming to Arlington on the anniversary of her father's death, how she had saved money from her allowance to buy flowers for his grave, and how she had practiced the special signal every night, hoping to find her daddy's friend who had promised to take care of her. What happened next surprised everyone, including Marcus himself. Instead of immediate disciplinary action, Patterson made a decision that demonstrated the wisdom that comes from understanding that true military honor sometimes requires the courage to do what's right, rather than what's prescribed. She recognized that Marcus's actions, while technically a violation of protocol, embodied the highest ideals of military service: loyalty, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to taking care of one's own. Rather than ending Marcus's watch in disgrace, Patterson announced to the gathered crowd that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a testament to the bonds between soldiers and the promises that transcend death. She invited Sofia to participate in a special ceremony, allowing the little girl to walk alongside Marcus for one complete sequence of the guard routine, making her an honorary sentinel for those precious minutes. The sight of a 7-year-old girl sharing the most sacred duty in American military tradition moved the crowd to profound emotion. Sofia matched Marcus's measured pace as best she could, her small legs working to keep up with his longer stride. When he paused for the traditional 21 seconds, she paused with him. When he executed his ceremonial turn, she turned as well. Her childish discipline and obvious pride were a testament to her father's training and a tribute to all the soldiers who had given their lives for their country. The Vim story of Sofia's signal and Marcus's response spread around the world within hours, becoming a symbol of what military honor truly means when stripped of bureaucracy and reduced to its essential truth. That the greatest service members are those who understand that some things are more important than following orders, and that the highest honor comes not from blind obedience but from the courage to do what's right when it matters most.